video, we'll be looking at still Unit 1, AP Biology, the properties of carbon, and some of the chemistry associated with just carbon by itself. Carbon is an interesting molecule. First, anytime we're talking about the chemistry of carbon, that particular branch of chemistry is called organic chemistry, which is where we'll spend a lot of our time this year as far as chemistry is concerned, and of course not getting into the depths of what is organic chemistry. Hopefully for some of you will get to experience that at the university level, but for our purposes we're keeping it fairly simple. Carbon is approximately 30% of an organism's dry mass, or its biomass, which is the biomass is the dry mass of an organism. Like if you literally take all the water out, approximately 30% of that organism is just straight up carbon. And carbon, of course, is essential for the creation of lots of different molecules. Here's carbon here. Carbon is tetravalent, which means that it has 4 available spots in its valence shell. Tetra meaning 4, valent of course, valence shell. This tetravalence allows carbon to kind of act like an intersection between lots of different molecules. It allows it to make many different kinds of connections. So here's a picture of just some of that. Of course, it can make those connections with itself very easily, as you can see in a couple of these examples here. Even here, a double bond, but notice even with a double bond it still has 4 bonds that it's making. Or something simple here like this methane, 1, 2, 3, 4, very simple, but that does allow carbon to be a very versatile molecule. Even here between these two you have the same number of carbons, but ethane and ethylene are 2 completely different molecules with different properties. And so because of carbon's versatility, it can basically make an infinite number of molecules. One example of one of those molecules is called a hydrocarbon. These are molecules that are mostly containing hydrogen and carbon. Hydrocarbons are usually sources of energy in living systems, things like fossil fuels, which we're very familiar with, gasoline, oil, but also just oils and fats in our own bodies and the things that we eat. And what a way of thinking about this is the more hydrogen atoms a molecule has, as you can see this one has quite a few hydrogens all over the place. The more hydrogen atoms a molecule has, the more energy there is in that molecule. Another important part of hydrocarbons is they make up the cell membrane. These little pieces are called phospholipids. We'll talk more about those when we talk about the cell membrane. But the phospholipid is essentially this hydrophilic part, and these hydrophobic tails. Hydrocarbons are extremely hydrophobic in nature. They're nonpolar. They equally share the electrons. And oftentimes, just as a note of something you'll see a lot as we go through the year, note here how these hydrocarbons are represented. The H's are not drawn out. You don't have all these branches here. There's no need to write all that. It's understood that when you're dealing with just carbon branches like that, you can just draw the lines. And so sometimes you'll even see rings that are drawn that way, like carbon rings. We'll see this a bunch as we deal with like glucose and some nucleic acids. It's the assumption there is that carbon is being dealt with. Here's a picture of the cell membrane, a little more fuller picture of that. You can see the phospholipids and all the different pieces of the cell membrane, but we will talk about that at a later time. Speaking of, there's the number 7. Speaking of carbon and being able to look and recognize molecules, we will be learning about something called functional groups in this class. And functional groups are just a way for us to be able to recognize molecules. This is an example of that, even though this particular example's not very good when it comes to functional groups. You can see some functional groups here, but steroids, this is a picture of a steroid. They always look the same. But I'm going to give you six functional groups that will help you identify molecules. And so here is the first one. It is called a hydroxyl. We've dealt with this already, this OH, which is called a hydroxide ion. So you get where this is coming from. Anytime you see this little OH right here on the tail of a molecule or stuck on some place of a molecule, it is called a hydroxyl group. And so here's an example of that. This ethanol is the alcohol in alcoholic beverages. This OH is just stuck on the end. Usually when an OH is added to something, that is called an alcohol. If it's just a single OH like this, and it's going to cause this molecule also to exhibit some different properties. And so whereas before there was this equal sharing of electrons because nothing stuck out, now all of a sudden we have this big O oxygen right here, and that oxygen is going to attract more electrons in this end of the molecule, and so it's going to create this polar property to this molecule that it didn't have before. It's going to allow it to dissolve it's going to allow it to dissolve organic compounds like sugar, as you see here, and salt and whatnot. It gives it this this attraction to other electrons, drawing electrons towards itself. And so that's our first group. The next one is called a carbonyl group, and the carbonyl or the carbonyl group is a double bonded oxygen to a carbon, just like you see here. Again, you're going to have some polarity because of that oxygen there. You can see this in a couple of ways. It can either be in the middle of a molecule, and when it's in the middle of a molecule, it's called a ketone. Like here, acetone is something that's used in chemistry labs. Or when it's on the end of a molecule, it's called an aldehyde. And so these molecules have completely different properties, even though they have the exact same chemical formula. So this says structural isomers, and isomers just a different shape. All it is, you don't need to really dwell on that. The third type of functional group is called a carboxyl. So we have a mixture of hydroxyl and carbonyl, a carboxyl. We have this double bonded oxygen here. We have the OH here. And so this one's going to, of course, it's going to be a polar molecule, and it's also going to exhibit some interesting functions because of that little hydrogen. You know, hydrogen is prone to wander, and so sometimes that hydrogen will actually just kind of go away, and it will leave that negative oxygen, and then you'll have H pluses or hydrogen ions building up in the solution, which of course, when hydrogen ions are building up in a solution, this can create an acid. So sometimes you'll see these called carboxylic acids. They create, like it says, acidic properties because of the hydrogen ions, and you have that polarity as well. So the fourth functional group, before we go into the fourth one, these carbon functional groups, usually you will find them in lipids and in carbohydrates in particular. And so we will talk about how to distinguish between carbohydrates and lipids, but the rest of these are going to have an easier distinguishing mark, and it's going to make them a lot simpler to see. Like this one, the amino group. Amino is nice and simple because it has this big fat blue ball or nitrogen in every time. It's NH2. Sometimes you'll see a third hydrogen there, which we'll talk about in a second. This is called an amino group because of this nitrogen. You have seen the amino group and you've heard it before in such words as like amino acid. Well, if you have an amino acid, what do you think is on the other side of the molecule? It's our friend, the carboxyl group that we just talked about. So in an amino acid, this is your basic amino acid right here. You have the amino group and you have the carboxyl group making up the amino acid. Sometimes amino groups can act like a base, and the way that they do that is they pick up that hydrogen, pull it out of the solution. So there's less hydrogen in the solution than there is hydroxide, thus creating a base. That happens sometimes. It doesn't happen all the time. Again, not important. This is for us recognizing molecules. When you see that N with two H's on the end, usually what you're looking at is a protein because amino acids make up proteins. The next one is called a sulfhydryl group. The sulfhydryl group, of course, is simple enough to recognize because there's a sulfur in it, big old yellow sulfur. Sulfur is also going to be found in proteins. It's a very essential part of, there's two amino acids that have sulfur in them, and those sulfurs and those amino acids form what are called disulfide bridges, which we'll talk about later. It makes proteins very recognizable. That's about the only way we're going to talk about them in here. We're not going to deal with any more chemistry concerning the sulfur. And the last one is called the phosphate group. We will spend quite a bit of time talking about phosphates in here. It's a phosphorus with 4 oxygens surrounding it. This causes some issues. This phosphate group is highly negative because it has all of these extra electrons on it. And this allows the phosphate group to take on certain properties. With the DNA molecule, it causes the molecule to kind of bend and have that helix that we're familiar with. And in ATP, which has 3 phosphates, adenosine triphosphate, that third phosphate is stuck onto the end and the negatives don't really like each other. And so that repulsion is actually the source of energy for what ATP does. And so it's an essential, very essential part of how our cells operate.